Right. Welcome to the June instance of the Terraform on Azure community call. Happy to have everyone here. Thank you for joining during the middle of summer. Hopefully, you've been able to catch some sunshine wherever you are in the world. And we are happy to have you. For today, there are no significant updates from the product group side. I'm happy to talk a little bit about some small updates if we end up having some gaps in conversation, but this is a mostly community-driven session today. So feel free to share whatever is on your mind or top of mind, and then we can sort of just take this time to discuss and share about all the different things we're running into in the Terraform and Azure landscape. Um, yeah, my one question, since we're getting closer to it, is does anyone know yet if they are planning to come to HashiConf? Because we will be there. Microsoft always, I think, tries to be there. So we just want to make sure or start asking that a little bit ahead of time in case people aren't aware of it. It's probably a little early, so otherwise, I'm happy to open up the floor. Does anyone have anything that's top of mind for them with Terraform and Azure? Cue the 1 or 2 minutes of silence. I will open with a small thing just to see if we have the brain juices flowing afterwards. So, we have been working on improving some of the documentation for AZ API. If you have used the provider before, you've probably felt the pain, to be quite frank, around the lack of usable examples. So we have been working on that, and now we do happen to have a uh, improved experience, especially within the Terraform registry. So we are still in the middle of figuring out how to best represent this, but if you are looking at the docs for the latest version of AZ API, we are currently adding in examples. You can see all these Microsoft resource providers that are listed now. So if I were to go to, for example, compute, these are all examples that were auto-generated from the resource provider or resource team for a variety of scenarios. So now you have an actual example at some degree of um, sophisticatedness relative to Azure RM's examples that you're also familiar with. And we think that this is a great first step in getting a lot of the um, learning curve sort of absolved when it comes to the AZ API development experience. There is a problem, which is that we have guides here, and then we have a ton of Microsoft.rp, and then we have our other stuff like functions and resources and data sources here. This is a restriction today in the Terraform registry. So we are in talks with Hashi to see if we can get this nested into like a reference folder. If you are running into this, we apologize for that. Luckily, you can just use the search function here to help skip over some of the noise that is happening. Or if the reverse is happening and you're looking for a storage account, you can definitely do that by doing a quick little type like so. The other thing that I know we have delayed since our last call that I previewed was the Microsoft Graph Provider for Terraform. We are in the process of finalizing that. We are delaying it mostly because we had similar examples that we are trying to incorporate into the release. So they happen to be just the last thing that we're trying to get in, and then we want to release that because we don't want to release it for all of you, and then you don't have examples on how to actually deploy the stuff you care to use. So that should be coming hopefully by the end of the month, but we will keep you updated if there are any reasons that that changes. There's a question there in terms of whether or not the examples are generated from AI. They are not. We are in the process of doing some preliminary research. So these examples that I showed you were all written by the service teams back when they created the REST API specifications. So they usually have a single API version, right? And to your point, Stephanie, I think if I'm pronouncing it correctly, there is a problem with different API versions having breaking changes, having different issues there. We're in the process of seeing if we can try to use a melding of AZ API, which somewhat understands how these things should be represented in Terraform, as well as the API version sort of through a mix of generative AI and human validation and some of the work that has already been done by these teams to help with aiding that issue that has kind of existed for a while here. I did see someone post an issue from the Azure AD provider. Yeah, so for those who might not have attended when we first talked about the MS Graph provider, a lot of the reason that we created or we had a desire to create this provider was because we saw a lot of these feature and functionality lags that sort of have been a pain point for all of you. And to be honest, our team's bandwidth has just been strapped for getting to those issues, or the graph APIs have been behaving in certain ways, and for this reason or that, we aren't able to support new changes because it would break a lot of other things. The MS Graph provider is a way to sort of just say we will directly reflect what the API does. We are not going to try to have a manual implementation layer. It's very similar to how we now have these API compared to Azure RM. So if you are looking for some sort of features that have not shown up in the Azure AD provider, when the MS Graph provider comes out, that would be my recommendation for the short term. Obviously, it is a preview provider, so use at your own risk. And definitely let us know or flag anything that looks wrong or just funky from a Terraform perspective. We want to make sure that that provider is a good experience for you because we are trying to use it to help with the same problem that honestly, right, we've had in a long time in Azure RM. It exists today in Azure AD, which is I can't use this feature. Help me get it faster. And with this provider, we should be able to do that. All right. So any other thoughts? If not, I'm gonna just read the question in chat about governance so that we can have that for the recording. Okay, the question that we have in chat, or the topic, I suppose, is I'm looking into improving our governance using Terraform, looking into landing zones with Terraform, not sure where to start with the recent changes with the Azure Verified Modules, AVM. People seem not so convinced about them. Does anybody have any tips or experience to share on this?
I would recommend going with the AVM modules for net new deployments. They're not 100%, but they're a lot better than trying to come up with that on your own. And if there are any issues, you can just raise them or create the pull request. So I would personally always choose to go with AVM for most of our deployments now. I just think it's a more streamlined way of deploying landing zones and resources.
And I'm not sure if Stephanie or someone else could help fill in the gaps there, which is is there a way to sort of, or does anyone have context on those recent changes with AVM?
The bootstrap that Jared has built we've used that a few times, and at first it was a bit of a complicated process, and it obviously spits out a huge Terraform repo full of V1 and hub and spoke files, even if you're not going to deploy them. But if you just take the time to work it out, it's actually a lot simpler process. We did really like the CAF Enterprise module that came before it, but obviously this is the recommended approach now. And I've even started testing out Jared's migration tool. If anyone's on the CAF Enterprise, Jared's created a tool that will help you migrate to AVM. And I've just tested that out with the management group and policies. And again, that was a pretty simple process to move over to the new modules. So.
Great. Next question, is there an easy way to convert ARM template code to Terraform code? Yes, so let me give you two. So if you are using Azure RM or your goal is to try to use the Azure RM provider, I would recommend that you check out the export tool. There is an export tool that is called AZTF export. There's also a recently public previewed Azure portal experience for that. Makes it really easy. All you have to do is just take that resource and then run the export template feature for the Terraform Azure RM provider. So that tool enables you to convert your existing resources into Azure RM. It will not create modules. It will not create production standard code, unfortunately, yet. Maybe someday. But for now, we highly recommend that whatever code you do export, you modify to sort of match the production standards and good practices that exist out there and go from there. The second way to sort of do this process is if you are trying to move to AZ API, AZ API is way more deterministic than the existing Azure ARM provider. So if you have ARM template code, you can actually copy the ARM template and paste it into VS Code. And if you have the Terraform extension downloaded, it will actually go ahead and do that for you, which completely saves so much time for a lot of those processes. So that is actually going to be more accurate than what is currently in the portal, but it is requiring you to download and have the VS Code extension. So would recommend that people take a look at that. So it's the Terraform AZ API extension. Let me see if I can pull it up. And I will circle back to it. I see someone has a question about the Azure DevOps Terraform provider. That is totally in scope for this conversation or this group, so feel free to come off mute or type your question in the chat.
Yeah. I was working with the Azure DevOps provider trying to scaffold some access. So like in Azure DevOps, there's groups and permissions and teams. And in our org, we have people who have been granted basic access and stakeholder access through the Entra group. So the Entra group has like the claim or whatever. And then when trying to use Terraform to say like person X is now a member of team Y, and that person hasn't touched DevOps before, like they only have the claims through the groups, it would fail to do a lookup block. So if you do Azure DevOps users to try and find that user by their email, it would say that they're not enrolled unless you explicitly added the user and granted them basic or stakeholder access. So is that just like how it is? Like until someone opens Azure DevOps and tries to access something, even if they have permissions through the intra group management side, they won't like manifest in DevOps until they've actually tried to access things.
Is that a question for me or is that a question for the group?
I guess just anyone who's had experience with this, because I know in the web interface, like if I'm trying to add someone to a team and I type their email, then they show up in the IntelliSense, like the dropdowns in the web interface. But Azure DevOps, when querying for that user using a data block, it says that they don't exist.
That is how it works. There's a thing called like entitlement resource you can grant, but you probably won't have the permissions to do that because you got to be an organizational admin. If you do that, they'll then be known to the system and it'll show up. How we work around it is we go and look for users that are known to Azure DevOps and add them, but leave the other ones. We don't try to add them or it'll fail. And then the first time they ever log in on a subsequent Terraform run, they'll be added directly.
Okay, so it's not the entitlement. Like there's no way around getting them to log in for the first time for it to be easy at least.
If you have the service principal with the permissions to like import them, then you can do it. But usually organizations won't give you that because that's a pretty and super powerful principle.
I think I'll be able
Permission
to get that to work out. So if I do have access to that permission. So are you saying that you grant the users the individual entitlement? Because I think right now they have a group entitlement.
You have to give them the individual entitlement. It creates them as like a member. That's
Mm,
how Azure DevOps then knows. Through the UI, the web UI, when you add them to a team or something, it's doing that behind the scenes from a different API that you're allowed to as a user to do that. The
yeah.
Terraform provider doesn't use that.
So if a user has a group entitlement to stakeholder access, and then I grant them I add them to a team manually using the UI, is that creating a direct assignment for the user to have the stakeholder access?
Basic is a license entitlement, not a user entitlement.
Okay. Yeah, that's an important distinction.
So this is the resource that's the user entitlement. I put it in the chat there. And that includes a license entitlement, but it doesn't, so you can set them specifically that way too. But that is what makes it like show up in Azure DevOps user pool that you can then pull from if you want.
I think I might have tried that, and then I started getting issues with it saying that the email belonged to an external stakeholder, which was, I think, where where that attempt ended. So I'll keep trying. Thank you for the insight.
Definitely frustrating. Been down the same road.
I see a hand raised there. Jeff, good to see you.
Yeah, just wanted to pose a question, not necessarily for you, Stephen, any insight from anybody on the call around testing modules. So my company, we create our own modules that are very opinionated building blocks of the internal platform that we're hosting for a web service. And we test these modules through CI/CD pipelines, but they just because we're deploying things like Azure Firewall and Kubernetes service, it take forever to run and deploy. So I'm curious how other people are testing like versioned modules that they might be creating beyond just a Terraform plan. because there's nothing like a apply to really test them. Um, any ideas or other patterns that other people are using would be useful.
I know that testing is an interesting thing because especially unit tests are a little bit fuzzy in terms of how that can be done in a deterministic method within the DevOps world. There are some tools that have kind of swung at the fences there, but I don't know if other people want to chip in with their own experience there.
I
Well,
think in my
yeah,
case, oh, sorry.
please go ahead.
Okay, yeah, I was just gonna say that usually what we do is we deploy. We have a separate subscription where we have all the networking and everything, and then we just deploy the resource. Why? Because we have private endpoints, we have DNS records. The DNS records are not in actually private DNS zones, are in a different DNS solution. So we want to test the whole thing and see how it really deploys. So I guess in every company that I have worked for, we have done the same procedure. Like we deploy it, we make sure it deploys correctly, and then obviously we destroy, and then we just I guess release the version of the module.
Yeah, that sounds very similar to what I'm doing now.
Yeah,
To test all the integrations of modules talking to each
correct.
other. We build
Yes.
it, we destroy it. Just hoping, maybe I was hoping maybe there's something I'm missing around how to shorten that feedback loop. 'Cause some of those pipelines take an hour to run.
Yes, and like for instance, currently we're working on a module for the flex consumption function app,
Mhm.
and it deploys totally different to the normal function app because the service plan is different, how the function app works is different, how it communicates to the storage account for the backend is different. So it's like, okay, if I was going to do something else, I wouldn't be able to get that feedback. And we see that it deploys, but in reality it's not working, but it's deployed. So then it's like, I think I think it's better to deploy it because then you can see that it's really working and you don't release something that is really faulty because you're not sure the integration with the services that is required or the dependencies for the function of work or not. But yeah, that's my experience.
Appreciate that.
Yeah, basically, I was just going to say the same thing. In our company, we also create our own versioned modules, and we are struggling on how to test them properly. Currently, we don't have any automated pipelines for that, but again, we apply the resources on a test environment since or sandbox environment, check out if it's working or not, and just destroy them after that if needed. Because yeah, the thing is that you're not sure if when afterwards you run the plan, if the apply is going to be successful or not. Basically, the plan might be successful, but the Terraform apply after that might not be successful. And yeah, we don't have any other choice on testing actually, because there is not currently on the market any framework that could actually test the actual behavior of deploying resources to the cloud.
Right. Stephen, maybe an extra question on top of that. Is there any documentation or guidelines that the Azure M team provides on the boundary between how much validation is possible in the plan versus actually instigating changes against the Azure API with the apply?
I think he's frozen.
Looks like it.
Yeah.
Hey folks, sorry. Looks like my Wi-Fi just boomed on me, so I am now on my phone. Unfortunately, that is how things go, right? Jeff, did you have a question for me? I heard like 2 sentences from you before I completely died.
Yeah. The conversation was a little bit about how Terraform Plan with the Azure M provider is often insufficient for determining how successful an apply is actually going to be. Is there guidance or documentation from the provider team on the limitations that us as consumers can expect from a plan? Because obviously there's things like it's never going to detect quota limitations in your own subscription. But is that a limitation of is that a designed limitation of the provider, or is that a Terraform like HashiCorp limitation, or like a design decision on just not putting in the work to get that kind of validation? I'm a little in the dark on where that boundary lies of what we can expect for validation.
Yeah, so here's my understanding. When Terraform Validate or Terraform Plan runs, the general design philosophy across both, well, yes, for all providers that HashiCorp owns, and I could be wrong about this, so please don't hold me to it, but my understanding is that they don't want any calls to actual backend APIs during Terraform Plan. So when you run Terraform Plan, it is meant to essentially validate against whatever the provider instance downloaded locally to your machine or whatever you're running it on has. Now, there is tooling today like the Azure policy and pre-flight features that essentially are get requests you make against a request body more or less, and you basically have that whole thing run, and it will tell you whether or not something will fail due to either resource service teams have flagged certain things to say this is going to fail, and at the same time the policy team has built in an evaluation tool to say this is going to fail. Those are not in the Azure M provider today due to, I believe, that philosophy. I could be wrong, but that is my understanding. So what we are aiming to do is bring in some sort of native Azure M functionality, but we also, at least within Azure M, have to do it without making the REST API call during Terraform Plan. Now, AZ API does not have this restriction because AZ API sort of flows freely and independently of those guidelines, for better or for worse, to be honest. But as a result, AZ API supports pre-flight out of the box, and pre-flight includes policy. So as a result, you can sort of get all of the different restrictions, not everything under the sun, right? But at least to a much higher level, you will have a good idea of catching those gotchas before they happen. Now, does that mean that you should completely give up on using Azure M? I don't think so. Does that mean that you might want to look at AZ API for things that are more critical to you in that regard? That might be worth considering. We've played around with a few ideas. We haven't had anything come to light yet necessarily that really works, but we welcome the feedback. We've honestly like prototyped binaries. We've prototyped different solutions and ideas to try to get in between, but we have yet to necessarily arrive at the destination, if you will. So that is an ongoing process. We know that pain because yes, so many times plan will say that nothing is wrong. But nothing is wrong from a HCL perspective or from a schema perspective. But from a REST API behavior perspective, a storage account has to be globally unique. You cannot know that during Terraform Plan if you're not calling a GET request against everything in Azure to make sure that that storage account is unique. So those problems continue to exist today. We're in the process of trying to absolve them.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Of course. I think Sai is next.
Hey, hi, Steven. Thanks. I have a quick question regarding access reviews for Azure AD groups. So currently, I don't see Terraform. Suppose, or excuse me, maybe I don't know if there is a code block that can support access reviews for the Azure AD group. But I came across this link, a GitHub issue link, which discussing about this request of to be able to create access reviews for groups. So if this is not supported currently, what do you know any other ways using Terraform can we create access reviews for our Azure AD groups?
I know one that is going to release, hopefully by the end of the month, the MS Graph provider. When that releases, please go ahead and take a look at it and let me know if it doesn't work for whatever reason. But that would be my recommendation in terms of getting yourself unblocked. We are in the process of, I mentioned this earlier, getting reference docs generated so that we don't leave you out to dry in terms of usage examples. But that will be a process that we're sort of going under. Hopefully that helps.
So do you have any documentation for the graph provider you are talking about? Is that a new one coming up?
It's coming, yeah. So it's about to preview at the end of this month. I don't have docs for you today because the docs aren't public yet. But
Okay.
when it releases, please take a look. We are aiming for the end of this month.
Okay, so there is no like direct Terraform API that can create access reviews, just like how we can create groups.
You could definitely use the Graph API itself, but then at that point you're just working with REST APIs.
It's different from
so
the AZ API provider.
It is different from the AZ API provider. Basically, the AZ API provider supports day zero services for Azure REST APIs, and the MS Graph provider is day zero support for all Graph APIs, so
Graph
Entra
APIs.
and M365.
Okay. All right. Yeah, I'll keep an eye for the documentation.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Other items. Before I forget, let me actually show people how that Terraform AZ API provider will work, especially for the recording, for those who joined from other time zones or weren't able to make it today. So when you install the AZ API provider, here is what you will see on the, or when you install the VS Code extension, this is the link that you'll see in the marketplace. Once you have this all installed and good to go, there are a couple places that you can look. Number one, on the Terraform registry under AZ API, there is this link that talks about how to convert ARM templates to AZ API. So there is a step-by-step guide on exporting from the Azure portal. And the other method is to copy the ARM template JSON, like this example, and then paste it into a .tf file in the VS Code editor with the extension installed, and then it'll just convert it. That's what this example showed. The blog post we had for AZAPI 2.0 actually had a GIF here that kind of highlights it. So here I have the resource JSON, not the ARM template, but the process is the same. You highlight your code, you copy it, then you go over to the VS, sorry, not the VS Code, the VS, yes, VS Code with the extension installed, and then it pastes as AZAPI code. Hope that helps. Any other topics or questions or items for today?
I think you mentioned something for MS Graph. Can you show that as well?
Yeah, so the MS Graph one, I can show you what I have today, but nothing that you can work with today. So um, here, let me show you this. I'll just walk through this with everybody. This is not public, so you can't see it yet, but the community gets some special benefits. So here is what we currently have prepped for release. So this is the documentation that will be released for the Terraform for Microsoft Graph provider. There's a bunch of yada yada about all the goodness that happens, including the authoring experience. And you can see just from this little bit how much is supported. All these things that fall under groups are supported from day zero. And that will span across all of Entra. Now, the one thing that might get a little noisy here is that we don't really know the difference between Entra and Graph and M365 APIs. It's not clear. There's not like a systematic way to do that. So you might get a lot of different URLs when you play around with the VS Code extension IntelliSense there. But we trust that you will know what you want, and please give feedback if you think that that ends up becoming too noisy of an experience. The whole point of this provider, as we kind of talked about before, is that it can offer the day zero support. So that is the main thing that we're hoping for. In terms of what it will look like when you actually go and run this, the example we have here is an application group, and then you create a managed identity resource with AZ API. I know I'm scrolling a little fast, so feel free to stop me if you need me to go back over anything. Then you can make the managed identity an owner of the resource, and you have this great little segment of code that you can then run and deploy. In terms of conversion, can I know this was a question that people had in the past, so I'm just going to answer it now. Can I take an existing graph resource and convert it into Terraform? As of today, nothing yet, but we're working on it. So we are hoping that by the time we get this GA'd and get it 1.0'd, we can do the same pace experience that we have today. If you have that graph JSON and then you copy that and paste it into the editor, it should hopefully by the time we GA work. No timeline yet, but it will not be with the 0.1 release to my knowledge. Hope that's helpful.
A bit unrelated. Do you know if the Terraform providers have local logic for stuff like validating storage account name constraints, like all lowercase or whatever, or is that just sent to the server for a check?
I don't know exactly for that example, but I know that sometimes we might have a few sanity checks that run locally. There are definitely local sanity checks. As to how many of them are specific to Azure, that is not something I am necessarily aware of. To my understanding, case sensitivity is one of those major things that causes problems for people because I think we don't evaluate case sensitivity when we are doing Terraform plan because Terraform is not case sensitive, whereas Azure is.
I thought
That
it was
might
the
be
opposite.
another example.
Thank you.
Yeah, I guess to just add, I could be wrong about this, but my understanding now that I'm thinking out loud about it is I think what Terraform Plan does is pretty universal. So there is not like a unique embedded logic for any of the HashiCorp owned providers. Or at the very least, there is not unique logic to catch case sensitivity issues or globally unique
Yeah, so
storage
if you
account
run like
names or any of
validate
that.
instead of plan, it's not going to catch some of that.
Yeah, because it's valid in the sense of what Terraform and HCL care about.
It's a string, but it doesn't check the length. Okay.
I saw a link about AZ API reference. If there is a reference doc for something, it is supported by AZ API. That's correct. If you can find it under the AZ API reference, it's deployable and works for AZ API as a provider. Good question, Jeffrey, about will we be able to authenticate to the MS Graph provider with the same methods? That is going to support the same methods to my understanding. It shouldn't have any disparity. We've even intentionally just copy and pasted the authentication guide from our historical Azure experience in the docs. And if that ends up not being the case, we'll have a problem. But I'm like 99% sure that that is the case. Other questions? Going once. Going twice.
I can do a demo.
Oh, go
ahead.
ahead.
Sorry, I think we both jumped in at the same time there.
No, you first.
Just meant to ask, how many people on this group or whatever have been involved with actually contributing towards the providers, Azure RM, Azure DevOps, and Azure AD. Sort of following on from a question about the access reviews, which has been open for a year or two. Obviously, somebody's got to pick that up and do the work. And that is something that we can actually do, can contribute to, whether people are aware of that and feel that they can do that. I'll give an example of one that I did for it was Azure DevOps for the Git file repository or Git repository file, which wasn't available as a data resource. So I'd had to go off and initially I was using a HTTP resource to get the file from the Azure repo. But that, the mention of the authentication there was causing me great issues. I was having to put in a PAT, which I really didn't want to do. But the Azure DevOps provider, with its improved authentication, was a way forward for me. And I'd say, I had really good sort of experience of doing that, in that I submitted a pull request and literally within 24 hours, somebody, from Microsoft had done a code review of it, made some suggestions, all of which were good suggestions and made perfect sense. And then, implemented those suggestions. Another 24 hours later, it was approved and accepted. It's just a question of waiting for the next release of the provider, which came out within about a month. So yeah, it's just something to feed back to people, suggest to people that, you can dive into it, do it yourself if you feel able.
Thanks for that, Noel. One thing I will correct or double back on is I saw that there was the access review issue for the Azure AD provider, and then there is also an access review resource in AZ API. I'm not familiar with access review, but I'm assuming it's a bit like how some of the identity pieces work in this land, where there is an Azure representation and then there's an Entra representation that need to be linked to each other. So you can have support for one and not support for the other, even though they're both named the same thing. Dominique, do you want to go next?
Yeah, if we've run out of other things, I could give a code demo of some of the Cloud Terraform stuff. It's not as Terraform focused, but it might still be interesting to this audience.
Yeah, sure. How long is your demo going to be?
I got to show it off in a minute.
Works for me. Let's do it.
All right. So for the programmers among you, this is the Rust programming language, and I have published a crate called Cloud Terraform Azure. And that crate exposes a bunch of wrapping functions that wrap the Azure CLI. So when I run, for example, resource group list, this function is going to asynchronously call effectively the AZ group list command and then return the results, but as a struct that Rust is able to interpret. And I've implemented for those structs conversions into some Terraform code. So if you have a resource group, then converting it to the import block can take the resource group and do the ID equals whatever, and then 2, and then it will generate kind of a name based on the resource group disambiguated with the subscription ID. So this is just a bunch of helper utilities that I've used for my command line tool. So if you want to fetch resource groups or role assignments, then there's helper functions for all of that. And the important part is that it returns strongly typed objects. So for example, the resource group has a resource group ID, and a resource group ID is composed of a subscription ID and a resource group name, and the subscription ID is eventually just a UUID. But the reason to go through these lengths is for kind of like what I asked earlier is if you want to validate a storage account name, then being able to call locally without having to fetch the Azure resources and says, does this name comply to the specifications in Azure? So if I put an @ sign here, then this should fail because the rules for resource group names specify that you cannot have like @ signs. So having these helpers for the names specifically, I thought was interesting. So the other one is going from like parsing a resource group ID. So in this case, the subscriptions, whatever, resource group, whatever. So this should parse down into the resource group ID with the individual properties. So if I wanted to, if I had a list of all of these and I wanted to say, just show me the names, then I could instead say, let ID resource group ID equals ID.parse. And just get the name out, and that should work too. So those are the stuff that I've been doing. So if you want to get started with that, then the Cloud Terastodon Azure crate is what you want to look for, and that's mainly it. So the other one is the user input crate has some helpers for creating command line things. So if I said fetch all the resource groups, and then I wanted to have the user select one of them, then so let's say let chosen is pick. And we've got to provide the list of choices. So get the resource group expanded form. You chose this. So let's see if this works. Now I have a menu where I can build a quick CLI and say, pick the resource group you want to do something to, and then it gets the results. So that's some of the programming stuff I've been working on.
It's like the screen stop sharing. Am I the only one who saw that?
Sorry about that. The other thing was I also created a helper for validating, like trying to audit Terraform code. So if you have code where you've declared a required provider, and then, for example, you don't use that resource, then this should generate a warning. So if I open this in the terminal and then run CT Terraform audit, then it will say, first of all, no backend is specified. So if you lose your state file, you're out of luck. And the other one is that the provider for Azure RM is specified, but is not being used in the configuration. So trying to kind of build auditing tools for that is also something that I'm looking into. And this isn't quite perfect because it's not able to, if you use a module and the module uses this, but not any other top level resources, then currently it will cry wolf at that scenario. But in the general case, it's like, okay, you have some code where you're using a resource, but you haven't specified if you don't specify the required providers, then that should also generate a warning. So if I go here, then it should have a recursive flag. So this will scan all the subdirectories and say, okay, you have specified a provider as required, but you're not using it. You've specified a required provider, but the version doesn't match the latest version. So like you're out of date, or if the version is just out of date, then it will also kind of give you a hint here. So that's just trying to create some helping tools for that. It's not quite ready yet, but it's on the way there. So if other people have ideas on things that they would like to automatically be linted in their code that's not being caught by like Terraform Validate right now, then that'd be open for suggestions.
Might be worth taking a look at some of the linters that the AVM team is trying to build as well. I know that they are also trying to solve this problem to the best of their knowledge. Definitely a worthwhile investment, and thank you for demoing this. This is really cool, as it always happens to be whenever you demo anything, Donnie.
It would be neat to kind of have deeper rules and say, like, if you have a role assignment resource block and it's targeting a user who is not inside a specific intra group, then you could get really specific with the, I guess, org level policies. If you said everyone in our org who has a role assignment needs to be in this like approved users groups or something, then you could certainly go quite crazy with that direction.
Certainly could.
So Dominic, if we want to leverage whatever the code that you're building, are there any prerequisites for that?
You need to be using the Rust, like be willing to use the Rust programming language, which is embeddable in like Python and stuff. I just haven't written the bindings yet. So it's mainly Rust focused right now. And it uses the Azure CLI under the hood. So if you are not able to, like if you have problems with the CLI, like if you're, for whatever reason, like conditional access is blocking you or something, then that could be a blocker. But otherwise it should, fingers crossed, just work. There is some issues with encoding on like UTF-8 support, which the tool will warn you about. But in general, it should just work. Fingers crossed.
Yeah, looks great. Definitely, if you have the link, you can share, and I'm interested to take a look.
I put the source code in the chat. There is the crates IO page, but it's not. The documentation is a bit lacking right now.
Oh, and Steven, so a lot of new stuff coming up, like you're saying, the graph provider. So if you want to know like when this is going to get ready, or if it is even released to public, is there anywhere that we need to go and look for all these new upgrades and features?
Yeah, so there is the community, obviously. So if you're not part of it, definitely sign up for the Azure Terraform community. I will drop a link in the chat. Also, follow us on Twitter or X or Blue Sky. Those are two different things nowadays, even though I said three different things. And of course, make sure to just take a look at the Slack, which I'm also going to drop a link in, which has some practitioners as well. And I try to post there whenever there's any announcements.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yep, of course. All right, we have a couple minutes left. Anyone have any last items before we wrap up for today? Alrighty. Thank you everybody for joining. Great to see all of you, and we'll see you again at this time in August. If you are willing to stay up late or your time zones work out, next month in July we will have it the community call at, I believe, 3 p.m. So hopefully that works for you. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Yep,
Bye.
thanks, everybody.